Hello, welcome to Podsongs. I'm Jack Stafford, and I interview inspiring people in service to others as inspiration for a new song. Now, my favourite environmental podcast is Sustainababble, which is actually a comedy show about the state of the world, which is good because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. It's incredibly well put together, unlike the first 55 minutes of my podcast. So let me learn from Dave Powell. Because your podcast is so professionally put together. Are you responsible for that?
Yeah, I do that. So, believe it or not.
With all those inserts, the reactions, the music,
Thanks, man. Well, it takes a bit of time. It's probably we decided pretty early on that we wanted to. Do you ever listen to The Bugle? Have you listened to that ever?
No, I haven't, no.
So that's Andy Zaltzman's podcast. It was basically the model that we nicked. It was that kind of sort of fast-paced thing. I kind of wish we hadn't done it because it makes doing the work, it makes it a lot longer. You can't just kind of listen to it through and put it out. You've got to fiddle with stuff. But yeah, no, thanks very much. That means a lot, man. That means a lot.
We put the same amount of work into our music on the show, except I concentrate it at the end.
I mean, yours is more
the last 3 minutes.
Yours is more work, definitely. Like, there's no writing of songs at my end, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, but this is one of the reasons I want to have you on the show is because I want to write. I need more environmental songs. The world needs more environmental songs. So who better to speak to than the host of Sustainababble?
Yeah, thanks, man. Yes, what we need is environmental songs that don't really suck, because there have been some stinkers. Do you remember that one? I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago. There was one. I can't remember it now, but it was so horrible. Just like the real kind of like, whoa, let's save the planet type stuff. It had all stars in it. Oh, it stinks. I think it's a hard thing to write music about that, right?
I think so. It seems, spirituality as well. These most important subjects, they need the best songs, but then they're not getting it.
No.
Yeah. So I had Emily Atkin on, who writes the Heated newsletter. She gave me the lowdown on the current crisis. So I did a song about global warming. So that one's done.
Cool.
Tick.
Good.
So that, but it's a huge topic, so it leaves quite a few. There's still scope for you, Dave. Okay.
All right.
There's still virgin territory for you. Just go ahead and inspire me. So where do we start? I mean, where do we start? It's a huge topic.
Yeah. Are you right? Hang on. Before we start. What's the general, like, is there any stuff you particularly want me to talk about? Are there any kind of like areas
the environment
want to go? The environment.
No, nothing. Whatever you would like the song about, whatever you think needs to be,
all right.
Whatever you think is the most important subject, because you've had so many. You're up to 175 episodes of
nearly 200.
Almost 200?
Nearly 200. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, quite a lot. Okay.
You've covered everything, so you're the. Yeah. Do you keep a chart on the wall of the most important topics? And
it's really interesting, right? Because like, what does it even mean to talk about the environment and climate change? I've just come off Twitter. I've just been on Twitter just now, and I put a thing on there. I've got to stop doing this. I put a thing on there without really thinking about it, which is just not a good idea, is it? And what I said was, I get really frustrated by the word solutions. I hate it. I know Private Eye do that long-running thing about solutions, and they'll point out when people have got they've come up with a clean bottom solution, which is bog roll. And there's so much in the environment kind of world. There's so many climate solutions and like natural solutions, and what they basically mean is like some technology to do something about climate change, which is fine, but we have to call these things solutions. And I put this thing on there going, I hate the word solutions, because it's not the right way of thinking about what's going on, our relationship to the environment, and what's going on, what the state of it is, right? Because it's not, you don't solve a problem like climate change maybe you can't ever solve it anyway. It's not a discrete thing like that. It's not like you can solve the problem of someone kicking your door in by getting them to stop kicking your door in, right? But you can't solve the problem of your house like this flat here in Crystal Palace. It's sort of gradually rolling down the hill because of subsidence and the hill is going away. Look over, it's not going to do it overnight, but you can't solve that problem just by standing at a slightly wonky angle. Like, some things are bigger problems, and climate change and like natural destruction and these things, I don't like thinking of them as things we solve, things that we're in battles where there are winning and losing. And that's because I think that's kind of how we've got into this problem, that's seeing ourselves as separate to everything about our inner lives and our outer lives and the way we live as being separate, and these things as being discrete little moles that you just smack down with a hammer, and that kind of deals with it. So, I mean, there's a lot of topics that you could write a song about, but I guess I'm more interested really in kind of like the relationship between people and the planet and the state of everything. Because I think it is like how we are the planet and it is us, right? That's not some kind of hippie mumbo jumbo. That is just a statement of fact. We are all made of the dust in the stars, and that is us, and we are it. And there is no energy on life that does not come from the planet or the sun or the combination of those two things. And there is no experience we have that is not rooted in our environment in some way. And everything about the sort of mental toolkit that we've evolved has evolved because we've evolved on this planet and learned to live with its seasons and its weather and all of those things, right? And so many incredible freakish chances have happened just for our species to evolve in the first place, like the tilt, the thing called the axial tilt, the oblique angle of the Earth as it goes around the sun is exactly, I think it's something like 22.5 degrees. So we're not dead on to, that's why we have seasons, right? We're not dead on to the sun. We kind of slightly at a tilt to it, which means that because that's enabled us to evolve in exactly the way that we have. If we were any straighter, there'd be no seasons and nothing would grow or something. Don't know what that is anyway. But the point being, like, we have evolved purely out of and in sync with and in relation to the Earth and everything on it. So I think we should write a song about that. Do that.
Okay. So everything, all these initiatives are damage limitation.
Well, I think there's another way of looking at it, right? I mean, I think that by we, I mean, you got to check yourself, right? Because you kind of say we think. Like, often, I think what I mean is the dominant kind of Western Anglo-Saxon way of looking at humans' relationships to the world. But for the last 200 years, at least, we've seen ourselves as somehow separate to nature, that we have conquered it, or we're in the art of conquering it, and we're able to do things like Elon Musk with his big willy shaped rockets, and we're able to shoot free of the Earth and go, and the human species is somehow bigger than the Earth that we came from. That may or may not be true in that regard, but that's the way I think we see ourselves now. And you can see it in things like the virus and this thing that has happened because of all sorts of reasons. It's a function of the way that we live and the interconnectedness of our lives, and different countries managing it in different ways, which we don't need to really get into now. But what it's ultimately come from is it came from animals, as 70% of all new diseases do. And the more we are pushing into their territory and their turf, and the more that's going to happen. It's a miracle we didn't really have a pandemic of this nature until now. So I don't know. I think there's a kind of consciousness that I hope when the virus is settled, but I think when you actually sit back and look at it, that I think is the only way we're really going to solve, for want of a better word, this problem. And the problem is not one of, we're just emitting a few gases. It's that we as a species do not behave as if this is the only place in the universe we can possibly live at the moment, certainly within our lifetime. We don't behave as if it's the only thing we draw sustenance from, and that without it we are knackered. Because that's not the story that we have in our head. I don't know about you. I wasn't taught that when I was at school. I was taught, all sorts of other stuff, which is more or less useful, but I wasn't taught and brought up in that sort of cycle. And the metaphors we use about humanity, this is why I hate the solve idea, solving climate change. It's about there is a thing that is happening outside of us, and we will fix it with some tools, and then that thing that is outside us will be fixed and we can carry on. Well, no, actually, let's think about ourselves situated within that crisis, and part of it, it is us and we are it. And when you start to do that, and this is why I said the thing about Western cultures, I think other cultures do see themselves like that. You know, many indigenous cultures, many Eastern philosophies are about seeing yourself very much as part of a circular life, you know. And I don't think there's definitely a way you can take that is like woo, you know, it's also absolute ironclad logic to me, like that it is obviously the case that we are we're not somehow plonked onto this world separate to everything that came around it, you know.
Yeah, we're part of the system. I always think it's ironic when people like Elon Musk, we're going to colonize Mars, you know, and we're going to live there, you know. And when you see them in the movies, they're in like this Eden complex, you know, recycling the urine, reusing all the heat, saving every fraction of energy, you know, being the most sustainable they can. Well, why don't you just do that here?
Right. And like, to be clear, like I grew up watching Star Trek and Star Wars and all that stuff. And I remember when I was a kid, I remember watching the Challenger disaster. Was that 987? I remember watching that happen live on telly with my mum, right? And I don't want us to be a species that doesn't have that sort of intense creativity and wonder, like the things that are driving Elon Musk and that drove NASA to go to the moon, and the things that drive people to crack the human genome, and the things that do this are the same things that make people write art and the same things that make people do philosophy. And I think it's the wonderful thing about humans, right? Look at what we can do. Look at what, you know, look at what this collective brain can do. None of us could do it by ourselves. It's a collective. I think it's extraordinary, right? I just kind of think it's a shame that we've not been able to marshal up until now. Maybe we're getting better at it. The story that galvanizes us to live within the constraints of the planet that we've got in quite that way. I wouldn't ever want us to stop reaching for the stars in our brains, at least, right? But I do think there's a big problem we're not really devoting that attention to enough at home. That's for sure.
I was speaking to one of my other guests was Liv Bory, who was a professional poker player for a few years, and she also studied physics, and she's very into game theory and the multipolar trap, about how we, you know, if there's a forest and everyone needs the wood from the forest, and but your neighbor starts cutting down more than is good, he's going to get more powerful and invade your kingdom, so you have to cut down more trees than him. It's kind of a race to cut down the trees, you know, and that applies to everything. So, but they sacrifice their values for competitive advantage.
Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, the world that I kind of live in, you know, sort of lefty thinky environment-y sort of world, that sounds like the tragedy of the commons argument, right? Which is which is the basic idea that, you know, you take exactly what you said, right? You take, for example, a sea with some fish in it, and no one controls that. It's everyone's. Therefore, nobody has an incentive not to take slightly more than they need, because, you know, there might be a harsh winter coming up or whatever. And because no one has an incentive to share it out, the whole thing gets buggered, which is, you know, precisely what you can see as happening with the seas. Some people criticize that because they say, well, what that leads to is you then have to privatize everything. You know, it's often used by people as an argument for property rights and privatization. Is they say the only way you can get people to look after something, the only way you can get people to look after something, it is argued, is therefore to give them their fair share of it, tell them that's all they've got, privatize it, like we do with land in the UK, for example, right? But you can also draw ownership, right? Exactly, and it's not that that's necessarily wrong, but that obviously carries with it its own problems. But you could also take that in a really different direction, which is, well, okay, then, but maybe we need a better forum for making collective decisions about stuff rather than a series of individual decisions about stuff. So maybe we need proper governance models that are democratic, that people have a stake in. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it, but yeah, I mean, I do think that's basically right. And in my darker moments, I have. Sometimes I feel really optimistic about stuff, and I'm in a kind of optimistic space right now, I think. And it's certainly helped by Donald Trump not being around. It's helped by the sense, well, right, we're about, that is a problem for kind of global climate and environment action. If you've got a bloke in charge of one of the biggest polluters who says this stuff's all made up, that's a problem. So it's kind of quite good that he's not going to be around anymore. And I do generally think that as the world, hopefully comes out of COVID in 2021, obviously touch wood, cross fingers, I do think there's going to be this sort of uncorked sense of, right, okay, let's do something now. And before this year, before 2020, climate was getting there, right? 2019 was this year of kind of action where people got it. So I do kind of feel optimistic, but when I feel less optimistic is when I look at some of these kind of raw human tendencies, like you were saying, right? Like if we have shown that as a species, we are not very good at looking for the long term. We're not really kind of hardwired for it. Again, because, I think we evolved not to really need to do that. And we create systems about the whole way economies works and societies works that work just fine for meeting people's short-term desires, not necessarily needs, but don't work particularly well for the long term. And a lot of the battles of regulations and laws and taxes and all of this sort of wonkish stuff in the background, a lot of that is about trying to get these long-term things hardwired into short-term decision-making. But sometimes I do worry that that's a bit like whack-a-mole, that unless, again, we start to learn a different story about ourselves and how we fit into this whole thing, and to tell ourselves a different set of metaphors about our relationship to life on Earth. Until we do that, it feels like you're consistently just stopping our worst impulses. I don't really always feel like that, but I think when I'm down, I do.
Do you think the virus has been good for the planet on the whole, like less flying and less travel?
Short term, I mean, it's undeniably been good for it. I think there was a survey. I just saw the headline on the Guardian. I didn't open the link just before coming to talk to you. That the emissions have reduced in 2020 by the greatest year-on-year amount, ever, or something like that. Which it makes sense, right? Because we've shut down huge amounts of travel. Then I saw another thing, which I also didn't open. You can't open all this stuff. It gets you very depressed. I saw this other thing which said, yes, but actually it's going to have a very negligible temperature impact, because it's only 1 year's worth of carbon, and so you have to keep doing it year on year, etc., etc. And both of that can be true.
Hopefully there'll be a few more then. That's what you.
I mean, definitely, it's if you are generally going around punching 50 people in the face every year, one year you punch 40 people in the face, it is simultaneously true to say that's, well done, that's good progress, but also probably you want to try and punch even fewer people in the face next year. Otherwise, that was just a blip, wasn't it? So, but in the short term, it's been good, right? But I don't think we know what the long-term impact is yet. I can see two, again, possibilities for it. So one of which is, I don't know, it depends maybe where you live. I don't know where you live, Jack, but I live in London and...
South of Italy, yeah.
Right. So are you in a city or a town?
In the countryside.
In the countryside. Right. So I don't know what it was like, but here, under lockdown, a lot of stuff was bad. A lot of things were shut. A lot of people died. A lot of people were miserable. I'm not saying lockdown was good, but the air was cleaner. And you could hear the birds, and there was a sense of calm and quiet. And nobody I've spoken to, whether they're environmentalists or not, nobody says, I really hated those roads being quieter and the air being cleaner and being able to hear the birds. And I wonder what sort of, I don't know, I think it'll take time to see, but what long-term impact that has had, that people suddenly got a glimpse of a quieter sort of way of life. So there's that long-term thing that I don't know, what we know about. Then, the other way is, what does business as quote normal now look like? What do we go back to? We've taken huge, some things I don't think we're ever going to put back. I don't think the way we work is ever quite going to go back to the way it was, and in many ways that's a good thing. For again, a lot of people in cities, the idea of getting up, everyone gets up at 7 a.m. and everyone rams themselves into a metro car or a tube train or a car, and all descends on the same place and sits there in one place, getting a sandwich from a local shop on the way in, or a global chain or whatever, and then all goes home at the same kind of time. We've shown that certainly every day, a lot of places don't need to do that. And a lot of places over the last 9 months have kitted themselves out to not need to work like that, which is not to say the office is dead. But I think a lot of people, me included, will go, oh, it's quite good, this 2 hours I'm not spending traveling in every day. And it's quite good to spend a bit more time around the local place that I live. All of that stuff, I do think is going to have some sort of long-term effect. And you can see governments more positively starting to spend big on green stuff because they know they have to spend to create jobs and stuff, and a lot of that spending is green. So I think it's really good. But I do also I wonder what people are going to do when they're allowed to fly. You would imagine there's going to be a vast amount of flying again. You would assume all of that pent up demand is going to come back when people are allowed to drive wherever they want and go and see people. Of course they're going to do that. So I don't think overnight we're going to have cracked it. But I wonder what people younger than us, I wonder what the sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds who've had, a lot of them had an awful time from a mental health point of view. A lot of them have had a terrible time of the pandemic, but I don't think we're going to know for a long time. It's going to be fascinating, the longitudinal studies that can be done 10, 20 years from now, and you can look back at what changed in people's perceptions of stuff, what generations think differently about different things, and being able to pinpoint that to, they were that age when the virus happened,
Oh, yeah. Because I listened to your Christmas episode of your podcast, and there was these reasons to be positive. So there did seem quite a few, with the climate agreements and other things. So
I think there's a lot of reasons to be. I mean, again, you're picking up a theme here, I reckon, which is sometimes I can feel really miserable about this stuff, and sometimes really optimistic. And I think a large part of that is whether or not I'm thinking non-linearly or not. By which I mean, another thing I don't think humans are very good at in general is thinking about exponential kind of change. And you've seen this with the virus, right? That we can think everything is fine because today there are only 100 cases, and ignore the bit that says, but tomorrow there's going to be 120, and the day after that there's going to be 140, and the day after that 200, and we have shown ourselves, I think a lot of people who might have thought they thought better have been very surprised by how quickly a thing can go from being all right to not being all right with a virus. And that's a good thing, I think, in general, abstracted from the horribleness of the virus itself. It's a good thing to be reminded that stuff can change really quickly. And I suspect I think we are a little bit more tuned in as a culture, we'll see if this is right, to the idea that stuff can go bad really quickly, which is what climate change is all about. Because climate change is the really scary thing about climate change is it's not linear, right? It is not simply a case that if you increase carbon dioxide emissions by X, or if carbon dioxide emissions are X, that you're going to get X temperature change. It's not how it works. You're putting more and more things into a jar, and at some point, that jar is going to be too full to take anything else. Probably a bad metaphor, but you'll get non-linear things happening. You'll get, so much ice melts that the Earth is worse at reflecting stuff, so it warms faster, which means more ice melts, and you get into these kind of cycles of, what they're called tipping points, feedbacks. So that's the scary thing about climate change, and this is where all of the global temperature limits, when you hear people talking in a sort of whiffly way about, we need to keep temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, which is the overall ambition, or 2 degrees. That's not because there's something magical about that. It's just that the lower the temperature rise, the less chance of stuff going really haywire. The scientists reckon, that at that sort of temperature increase, it'll be warmer, a lot of people will still die, whole cities and towns may have to be moved to get a sea level rise, but we reckon we'll stay the right side of this thing accelerating out of control and the planet heading on a path to being uninhabitable by humans, right? So that's the scary thing about climate, is it's got that non-linear kind of thing to it. But when I'm optimistic, it's because human change is not necessarily linear either, right? Which I think is another massive lesson from the virus. We went
Mm.
really fast certainly in the UK, I guess where you are as well. We went really,
Yeah.
really quickly from it is totally normal to ram yourself on a tube train every morning and to hang out in a pub with 700 other people and go to a football game with 40,000 people and to be right next to strangers. Overnight, really was pretty much genuinely overnight, the social norm, a new social norm was created, which was it is not all right to do those things. In fact, it is morally wrong. It isn't somehow you are abrogating a responsibility by doing those things overnight. And while that was ostensibly down to governments telling us what we can and can't do, there was something deeper at work about humans' sort of psychology and our need to follow norms and our need to be in groups and our need to understand what is acceptable and not acceptable that was at work there, I think. And with climate, with environment, just because things have been slow up until now, it does not mean they will be slow tomorrow. Just because from the 20 years ahead of 2019, basically there was teeny tiny little increases in awareness, but no one really got it. Well, in 2019, globally, climate change became a thing that wasn't the silent issue in the background you couldn't talk about, but was a thing people talked about, and all the opinion polls of all countries pretty much everywhere will tell you, yeah, people get it now, right? So what happens if you get an exponentially increasing level of awareness and action and money and technological development and scientific warnings and all of that stuff starts to become a feedback loop? And although you can't rely on that, to me, I feel like something like that is going to happen, and it's why I'm optimistic about 2021, because I do feel that we're going to get not just the same amount of awareness increase and action that we had before. I feel like we're going to get 2 times as much, and the year after that, I feel like there'll be 2 times as much again. And I honestly am beginning to feel like so much has been the virus will just have shaken that up a bit enough for people to go, all right, you know what, we actually understand a little bit about how fast stuff can change.
Mm. So what would be one of the tipping points that you could see next? Have they modeled that kind of thing?
Well, in climate terms,
yeah, would there be like mass flooding, or maybe because we see these gradual things like these storms, and we hear about some distant islands that are going underwater, but people are still debating it. But what would be the radical, what could change overnight if one of these ice sheets melts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, so disclaimer, right? Don't at me if the science of this is not precise. So there's a difference between climate impacts. So there are many places around the world, and not necessarily, you're talking about whole countries like Bangladesh, which are significant parts of it are at sea level, where many millions of people may have to move. And obviously you get the kind of what climate change is not just a geographical problem, it's a human geographical one. People got to go somewhere, people got to move, people got to live, and there will be conflict, there will be tension. So you've got all of those impacts happening, but also close to home, right? Let's not think of this as someone else's problem. Cities in the UK like Hull, where I'm doing a bit of work for a project that I work on, a large part of that is under sea level and already has kind of flood defenses to kind of keep the sea at bay. So you've got impacts that are going to happen, but the tipping points is kind of scarier. The tipping points is stuff like, again, I'm not a climate scientist, but things like underneath the permafrost in Russia is huge amounts of methane, which is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, the one we're familiar with. So I think it's something like 8 times as potent. It does 8 times as much climate damage, which is why people get upset about farting cows and stuff like that, because that's what they're doing. But again, that's what I do when I fart, so I suppose I'm just as bad. And all of that stuff is under the thing that is potentially incorrectly called permafrost, right? In that it is less frosty and it may be less permanent. And so and you're talking about vast amounts. Someone showed me a graph 10 years ago of the amount of potential climate change that is locked up currently in gases safely under the Arctic tundra. Now, if that starts to melt, and I don't think the science is saying this is likely, but the point is it could happen. If you start to release en masse all this stored up gas, you've got a problem, right? Then you start to get runaway stuff happening. The ice sheets is another example of that. as discussed, ice reflects. So white stuff, you learn this in your physics lessons. White stuff reflects, black stuff absorbs. Wear a black t-shirt on a hot day, you'll be hotter than if you wear a white t-shirt. It's why where you live, I guess, all the houses are painted white, right? And not, for example, black. It's for that reason. So ice is generally a good thing, all things being equal, at reflecting heat back out into space. Less of it you've got rock underneath, which is darker. So heat starts to get, the less ice you've got, the more heat starts to get trapped by the Earth. And so you start to, that's a sort of example of a tipping point. And there are all sorts of other ones that, I go and have a look at. There's a guy called Mark Linus who does a load of really good stuff on this, who's written a load of books and stuff about what happens at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees, which is very much looking at, it is at this point that things start to happen, like the circulation of oceans changes because the way that heat moves around the Earth and the oceans is all to do with heat coming in, heat here and cold water there, and so they meet, and so you get circulation of oceans, which is why countries like the UK are the temperature they are. All of that sort of stuff that starts to get changed by climate change. Stuff I don't really understand starts to happen, but yeah, it's pretty scary kind of stuff. And I think, again, if you think of the climate as being a non-linear thing, and that what we're doing is, it's not like a little bit of climate change is okay and a lot of climate change is bad. It's like, no, the less of it we do, the safer we're going to be, and the less chance we have of stuff getting really out of control.
That's good to know, because you hear people a lot talk about 2 degrees C, and we must, they must hit these targets and that, and you kind of wonder how they're pulling out these numbers out of the air. How do they, they're measuring all the carbon in the atmosphere then? Yeah,
so it's I mean, they're nice round numbers, right? I mean, it's not like precisely 2 degrees is all right and 2.01111 degrees is not. So mostly it's a communications device, in that they've picked, a temperature rise that kind of feels all right. But I mean, to be clear, what that is not like, if it was it doesn't mean that if your temperature on a given day 20 years ago was 18 degrees, the temperature is going to be 20 degrees. That's not really what we're talking about when we say 2 degrees warmer. That's a global average. So some parts of the world will have significantly more than that. The Arctic, for example, will have significantly more than that. That's where warming is happening the most, because of stuff I don't really understand about how the physics, atmospheric physics, and how that kind of works, right? And what those numbers are, they are basically thresholds beneath which you are giving yourself a decent chance, but it is only a decent chance, something like a 66% chance of avoiding runaway impacts starting to happen. So it's basically all about risk. So it's not that we are saying it shouldn't be interpreted as, if we keep temperatures to rising by no more than 2 degrees, we are definitely all right. Not least because we've had temperature we're at 1 degree already, in fact slightly over 1 degree. What that is calibrated against is pre-industrial times. It's not against now. So it's saying, like, when people say a 2 degree temperature rise, they mean from before we started to get all that coal and oil out the ground and burn it. So we are already at 1 degree or something. At 1 degree,
so we're already halfway there.
Exactly, right? That's the thing. We've already done half of the damage that we can do. That's not a logarithmically correct argument, but you get my point. And at that temperature rise, we have got vast amounts of Antarctica falling into the sea. The ice in Antarctica. We have got wildfires in Australia, wildfires in America. Whole islands in communities in Alaska that are having to be moved because they're disappearing under the waves, right? This is happening already. So it's not like 1 degree is good. And the reason why 1.5 is generally now the global climate agreement, the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015 and will be revisited at the end of next year, that is aiming at 1.5 degrees. But the reason it's 1.5 and not 2 is because the smallest nations in the world, the small island states, the poorest nations, the ones who frankly can't have a bit of sea level rise because their entire country, like the Maldives, is at sea level already. They fought and pushed and said, no, like 2 degrees is the end of our country. Like at 2 degrees, that's enough sea level rise that we have to put every house in the Maldives on stilts or cover the entire thing, in a barricade to keep a concrete barricade to keep the water out. So 1.5 is a concession to that, but 1.5 is still bad, and it all does, in a way. I mean, it goes to what we were talking about at the start. It's slightly the wrong way of thinking about it, because it does imply you kind of manage this state. You create a state that is 1.5 degrees and it's fine, and things are a bit warmer, but we've got everything else sorted. But unless you've done that, the only way that kind of works as a way of thinking about it is if you've got massive great vacuum cleaners in the sky that is sucking out precisely the right amount of carbon from the atmosphere to manage this state in a perfect way. But in practice, that's not what it is. And in practice, what we're talking about is, how do we get around? How do we heat our homes? How often do we fly? What do we eat? How carbon intensive is the stuff that we eat? That's what we're really talking about. And that stuff, we just have to do all that we can as fast as we can, and frankly, bloody well hope it's enough. That is really what it comes down to. And a lot of this stuff can get much more complicated in terms of how people talk about it, but really that's what it's about. It's, let's do everything we can to minimize the risk of stuff getting worse than we can handle.
Because there's this momentum, isn't there? Once it's picking up speed all the time. It's not as if you can stop it.
No, exactly. I mean, the carbon that when someone drives to the shop and back, the carbon you put into the atmosphere on any given day will stay there for many years, right? It stays there as the sort of greenhouse effect metaphor, that basically that's what climate change is. You're wrapping a blanket around the earth, a blanket made of gas, which is easier for heat to go through as it escapes the earth than it was before, right? So the gas doesn't just disappear. You put it up there, it stays there for a good few years. So there's a whole load of this baked in already. If we shut down the entire globe's industry and housing and transport and everything, didn't emit a single fossil fuel from tonight onwards, we are still going to rise above 1 degree. It might get to 1.1, 1.2. I don't know. Not an atmospheric scientist, right? Which is why the sooner we do stuff, the better. Every gram of carbon you don't put into the air today doesn't affect the climate today or tomorrow or for 10 years after that. And this is why this is a sort of exponential process, because everything matters for a lot longer than just the moment of doing it.
So can we make a difference? Do you encourage people to act individually, or is it much more important what companies do and what countries do?
Yeah, I think both. And again, so the podcast that I do, Sustainababble, talks a lot about how big businesses will like to make you think that everything is our fault and only action will. And I don't want to caricature, right? That's a terrible thing to say. But a lot of the concept of litter, this is interesting. The concept of litter was invented in the 1970s by big plastics companies in America, who saw that there were loads of plastic and things going everywhere, and basically invented the concept. They had to put adverts on TV. You probably don't remember it. Maybe find a little clip. I don't remember it, but we did have it on our show, where they had the crying Indian. They had this Native American guy who was sad because there was plastic in the ground, and he picks it up and he's all sad, and then the message is, bloody well, pick your litter up, it's your fault, right? And because that's, by making it all our responsibility, it does, as you say, let them off the hook. And you see an advert for drinks companies, Coca-Cola or something like that, and all of their stuff will be, please recycle this. We want you to recycle this. Coca-Cola's making it easier for you to recycle, right? And there's definitely a bit of it that goes, but that is you are selling us this stuff. We don't need Coca-Cola. You are creating, through your advertising and your sugary addictiveness, you are creating this demand for stuff. You're making people have desires. If you didn't, you wouldn't advertise it. If advertising didn't work, you wouldn't do it. This is obviously what's happening. And the main thing you are doing, sure, you can be using more or less recycled plastic in how you make your bottles, but you're basically saying, oh, well, it's your fault, you deal with it. Or oil companies that are like, oh, well, it's not our fault that we make oil, we're just an oil company, but it's your fault for demanding oil. If you don't want climate change, demand less oil, right? Meanwhile, we're going to carry on drilling oil out of the ground. So I do reject the idea that the only way we fix this is by individual action, not least because what the bloody hell are you supposed to do? You go to a supermarket, I've got to go shopping after this and get my dinner, right? I walk in there, I don't know what the green thing to do is in a supermarket. I mean, I suppose I could go to the local hemp and happiness shop on the corner and buy stuff, but even then, there's things wrapped in plastic, and what foods come from the other side of the world or not, or it may be, I don't know anything about the labor standards that went into it. And even if you work all of that out, there's all the other things like the water that's gone in and the land. And the point is, it's so phenomenally complicated to work out what you're supposed to buy, even if you could do it, that how many labels are you going to put on things? You're going to put 25, 30 different labels on. You're going to do it all through people taking the right decision. And then on top of that, there's the unavoidable fact that it is true. It is definitely true that if you and I decide to cut our carbon emissions by living a frugal life and doing all that we can do, that is good. That will make us feel better, and maybe we can persuade some more people. But if no one else does it, it will achieve the square root of naff all, right? It will not do anything. That is the case. Like, it's this unique collective action problem that we've got, that it needs 7 billion people to all be doing something, but it doesn't really work if that doesn't happen, right? So all of that is why I'm a bit skeptical about individual change stuff. But also, there is an awful lot of stuff we, in my opinion, can and should be doing. So it can simultaneously be true that you need governments to regulate companies, that you need new sorts of business models to emerge, that all of these things, that is true. And ultimately, there is a limit to what I can do about that. But there are things I can do about that. So I can harangue my politicians. I can vote for people who actually will bring in rules on companies. Not once I voted for them. Democracy doesn't begin and end every 4 or 5 years. Once I vote for them, I can write to them. I can say, hey, here's a thing that's important to me. I can go and see them. My local councillors, depending on the structure of your government, my senators or governors or regional government or whatever. So you can do all of those things. You can make your voice count by politely getting your views across to the people who represent you. You can do that. You can use the money that you have and the purchasing power that you have, not just where you shop, but where you bank, who your energy company is, who your phone company is. In many ways, this is more powerful. I think it's more powerful to think about not what can of beans do I buy when I go to a shop, but who am I signing up to? Who am I making a financial commitment to? Who am I promising to give £40 a month to for whatever reason? What are their policies? There are better and worse, greener and less green versions of just about everything. Greener banks, less green banks, greener energy companies, less green energy companies. There are ones, and even you don't have to necessarily pick the perfect one, but they will ask them what their policies are. So it definitely makes a difference what you do with your money, because your pound is a bit like a gram of carbon. Your euro is a bit like a gram of carbon, right? Once it's left you, it doesn't cease to exist. It continues to be in the system. It gets given to an energy company who invest it in a thing, or who will put that into a share option, or who will use it to buy something else, or who will lend it to someone else. You put your money into a bank, it ripples around the financial system, increasing in value hugely, right? So just make that sort of informed decision about where you put your money. I think it makes a huge thing. The third thing is, if you are going to, this is really important, the flip side of that, if you're going to change your consumer habits, your banking habits, any of that stuff, don't just quietly do it. Don't just stop shopping at one shop because you've discovered that they do something bad for the environment. Like, tell them why. If you're going to move your current account from a bank to another bank, tell the other bank why, right? And they will tell you, they will say, oh, well, you shouldn't do that because actually we're really good for environmental reason X, Y, and Z. And you can say, well, all right, fine, but this other one was better. And not only that, but they made more of it, and they were more seriously. And tell them that in a nice way. Don't be a git about it, but tell them that, because people won't know. People need to know that there is a demand for this stuff, for alternatives, right? And then the fourth thing, I think that's why I love having this sort of chat. Talk to people. Talk to people about your feelings about climate change, the stuff you do and don't understand, about broader environmental destruction, about humans and how they live on the world and don't live on the world. And don't preach at people. Just have a chat. Just when you are next sitting around with your friends and family and they say, oh, how you doing, Jack? Just say, all right. bit bummed out about climate change though, and they'll go, "Oh, why is that then?" And you can just say, "Oh, I don't know. Look, I'm not an atmospheric scientist or any of that stuff. It just seems like a bit of a shame. That's all." You know? And
I heard of
for you,
Sustainababble. You know, heard this
I
and
heard
that. Yeah.
Sustainababble. That's it. Yeah, I heard some bloke banging on about it, and now I'm banging on about it. Because I do think the power of social norms starts with someone deciding that they want to talk about something. You know, a climate change and protecting the environment is not freakish and weird if it ever was, but it certainly isn't now. You know, like if I talk to my 8-year-old nephew about this stuff, he knows more about it than I do. You know, kids are learning about this stuff. You know, people who 20 years ago would have thought caring about the environment was for hippies and crusties and was a waste of time. Those people are now covering their houses in solar panels because it's just normal and what you do, right? Make it normal, be as normal about it, be as open and honest about it, and pay this stuff forward. So there are things we can do, but also don't just think that's job done. And, you know, any opportunity you get to put pressure on a business or a politician is definitely one to take, I think.
Yeah, it does work, doesn't it? Because they were trying to do drilling in the Arctic, and they couldn't because all the banks wouldn't lend it to them because of pressure.
Right.
So I was really surprised with that, you know. And that was Trump, you know.
That's it. And you know, a good example of that in the UK where I am is fracking, which is like shale gas fracking. There's a huge amount of it in America. A relatively new way of getting oil and gas out of the ground, which is not a good idea wherever you do it, but you can, to an extent, it makes more sense, given that it's not a good idea, to be clear about that, but it makes more sense to do it in somewhere like Wyoming, where the only things that live there is like a moose. Do you get moose in Wyoming? I don't know. But like people don't, you know, you get vast expanses. It's called Mamba, miles and miles of bugger all, right? So if you're going to put this huge rig, which operates 24 hours a day and makes a vast amount of noise and potentially poisons the water, there is better and worse places to do that. To be clear again, it is a stupid idea and we shouldn't be doing it no matter where it happens. But when they tried to do it in the UK, and for the last 10 years, the government of various colours has really tried to push this through. And it's pretty much dead. They never really got going because everywhere they went to try to do it, people, and this isn't like environmental activists, it's normal people, you know, just people who work in farms, people who would quite like their water not to have gas in it, thanks. People who don't want to be kept up all night by an oil rig on top of a hill, thanks. Said, no, bugger off, go away. Like, I don't want that. To the extent that the local MPs ended up winning or losing elections based on whether or not they oppose this thing, to the extent that there are now huge amounts of Tory MPs, governing parties MPs in the UK, who have been elected on a no fracking ticket, which makes it more and more and more unlikely the government can push it through, to the extent that no bank who wants to be seen as any way ethical is going to back it. To the extent that, you know, all the time this is going on, it's delay and delay and delay and delay, and people are losing money while that's happening, you know. And eventually the fracking companies, who aren't idiots, you don't get to be big petrochemical industries by being idiots. We're just like, oh, you know what, we're out, forget it, it's not going to happen, right? This stuff does definitely work. And it all basically starts from people going, what's that thing that's happening there? That's a bit, I'm not sure about that, you know, and just taking small kind of, I heard this wonderful, someone you should try get on your show is someone called Jill Coombs, is this amazing writer and activist, and she's you know, she's not the sort of, you have an image in your head of an environmental campaigner, and she describes herself as an introvert, you know, and she's written a load of stuff called The Trembling Warrior, and she describes us all as kind of trembling warriors to an extent, in that the only thing that you really need to do is the thing that makes you a little bit scared. And for everyone that's different, right? For some people it's giving an address to Parliament, or, you know, standing in front of a bulldozer. For other people it's just saying something to someone that they might not quite have had the guts to do before. But if everyone just does that thing every now and then that just is ever so slightly out of your comfort zone, but you feel like you can get there, if everyone did that, 7 billion people did that on climate change, and for a lot of people that might just be talking about it to someone when they may not have talked about it before, just think of the impact we could have. Think of how quickly that would ripple, and think about how unscary that would become the next time you did it.
Yeah. Who said that for evil to triumph, good men just need good men to do nothing?
Exactly. That's it. Yeah. And even if you, I think that's kind of where we've got to with the state of the planet. to be honest. I don't think it's a good or evil is the wrong way of looking at it, which is not what you were saying. But, but it is definitely the case that thinking that someone else has got this in hand is demonstrably not always the case, right? This is all of us are in this together, whilst also it definitely being more the fault of some companies than others.
So how did you decide to start the podcast? I mean, were you just, you're so passionate about it, or what can I do to make a difference? And that you thought you could do this? Obviously it's working. I'm saying, how did you arrive at that?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I was in the pub with Ol, my co-host, and I remember the start of the conversation, which was, I like podcasts, you like podcasts, talking about podcasts. And then I remember the next day that I seemed to have agreed to do a podcast. And I don't quite remember how that happened. But Ol, my co-host, has a slightly better recollection of it than me. What it is, so we both worked for one of the UK's biggest environmental organisations at the time. We now both still work in the sector, but we've got differently. And we're quite open about this in the podcast. Our day jobs were to go on telly and to write blogs and to meet politicians and to say, here is definitely the right thing to do. So it is definitely right that you should not build a nuclear power station because that's bad, and instead you should cover everything with solar. And you had to be, for example, right? And you had to be so kind of sure. There wasn't really much room for admitting that you weren't sure about that kind of stuff. And that's just on a technological level. You also just had to be sure in yourself. You have to, the job of being an environmental campaigner, when you're going to meet governments and stuff, is representing a position, and that's what you're being paid to do, and that's your legitimacy. But the more the more I think we both grew up and were like, well, it don't work like that. Like it is more complicated than that. And it is the case that we're not all being led up the garden path by a couple of industries, because there is more complicated stuff going on here with people and how they work and how we relate to each other and the stories we tell ourselves. And we thought, you don't get many podcasts that kind of admit that it's a bit more complicated than that. You do now. I mean, this was 6.5 years ago we were planning this thing. Right. There are more green podcasts now. But the other thing you don't get, and you don't get this in environmentalism anywhere near enough, is the ability just to have a bit of a laugh at it, which is not to say it isn't important. Like, it's profoundly important, and it's so important that sometimes all you can do is laugh at it, in the same way that Douglas Adams's books, it's always my inspiration, but The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and these things. I mean, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a book about when you zoom far enough out from Earth, the entire thing is completely ridiculous and you have to laugh at it, right? You take human behavior away from Earth and it doesn't get any less ridiculous. And if you actually look at how humans behave, if a Martian came down to Earth and looked at the way we treat the planet and the way we think about ourselves in relation to it, that there will be so many elements of it that you would have to laugh at. And there was no way of, a lot of people love the communication mechanism of things, of finding a way in through humor, and of a human story that says this, sometimes you've just got to have a laugh at this. And through that, there was no way that we knew of that was not just saying climate change is really important, shut up and listen as I give you an hour-long lecture and show you loads of graphs about diffuse scientific processes, and instead of that said, let's have a look at a company that says it's doing a green thing and isn't, and let's have a laugh at that. Let's have a look at how ridiculous it feels to be absolutely sure that something is the right thing to do when actually it isn't, and let's tell a knob joke or two, and kind of have a laugh at it. There are 99 other podcasts you can listen to that will give you a lecture, and then some of them are really good. I don't say the only way we need to approach this is by having a laugh about it, but we need to make this the sort of conversation that you would have with your mates in the pub just as much as we need to make it one that you have in a university lecture. And I think it is changing, but to go right back to what we were talking about start, where's the art that really understands climate change? Where's the comedy that gets it? Where's the drama that gets it? It's coming. But because we have for years just framed it as this scientific technical other problem. You know, the environmental problems are things we quantify and turn into numbers. There's too many numbers in that column. There's too much bad environment stuff in that column. We need to make more good stuff. And it's a scientific discipline. And that's where it's come from. And because that's the way we've kind of talked about it and thought about it, we've not seen it as a profoundly human story, which is what it is, about humanity and how it lives and what it thinks the right thing to do is, and the stories it has about itself and how we relate to other people and what we strive for. And as well as trying to put rockets on Mars, what else is the big, exciting story? We haven't done that until now. And I reckon when art and culture and music really starts to make people, to move people about that story, not the story of lines on graphs and technical measures, but the story of the only life we can conceive of is the one that is right here on this planet. The only consciousness we have, the only spirituality we have, has all emerged from evolving to live on this planet. When we start having art that does that, that's when I think we really unlock something. And I reckon we're on the cusp of doing it.
Well, I'm going to do my bit. I'm going to do a song about it. So
no pressure.
You brought it beautifully. You curved it around there, back to the start. Yeah, because I do get the feeling that you put the comedy on there, but you do deeply care for the earth. And
well, I mean, I think the other thing is that we talk. We're not afraid. I think it allows you the space when you tell a story. If you just tell a story that is really miserable and shit for an hour, no one's going to stay till the end, right?
No.
You wouldn't do that in the pub. You wouldn't watch a film that did that. You'd need to have the love interest, and you need to have the big car crashes. You need to have high and low. You need to have dramatic flow. And what it does is it allows, I think it brings into starker relief. We've had 2 or 3 episodes when we've gone, all right, we need to be serious for a bit. I am feeling really bad about this. We've both had episodes of better and worse mental health around the environment. And there was a time for me that was quite bad, a time for Ol that was quite bad. And I think it gives it more impact, and it allows you to have more space in the conversation when you're actually saying, okay, and I just need to say that I feel really bad about this. So I think it's a communications device as much as anything else, right?
Because you're studying every day. You're reading the worst news about the earth, and pollution,
and there's more and more of it. It used to be the case when I started doing environmental campaigning like 20 years ago. It used to be the case you could have a week off and come back, and there hadn't really been any news that you had to pay attention to. It's not the case now. You go to the front page of any main news outlet in the world, with a couple of exceptions, I guess, there will be something on there that says new study shows a new way in which we're buggered, right? And also, increasingly, new thing has happened where a company has done something great, or investors have done something good, or a government has done something. So there's so much happening now, but it can become a bit overwhelming, I think. And because sometimes in the middle of all of that, you lose just that little human voice that says, oh, bloody hell, like, what am I supposed to do about all that? I took a break earlier this year. I had to stop. It was all a bit much for me. Much better now. I do recommend having a break and having a little bit of a stop, because I think there is a limit, I reckon, to how much of this stuff we can take in. I don't know if we were ever really designed to pass the emotional consequences. If you actually think about it as an emotional story of what this means, the kind of, on some levels, the terror and the grief of it all, and the fear of something, a bit like the virus, the fear of something where it's not someone arriving with a gun and doing something to you, and a problem is solved by that person with the gun going away. It's not an other, it's us. It's a change to everything. What climate change and environmental change is our normal, our everything, the soup of chemicals and soil and land and air and everything that we exist in and that nourishes us, changing, which will change everything about us, including how we think and how we feel and who we talk to and the stories that we tell. It changes that. And that's much scarier. All the best horror films are not ones where some alien comes down and does something scary. It's when the thing hiding in the corner, the thing that is in your house, the thing that is safe, starts to become unsafe, when there's something under your
Oh
bed,
yeah, yeah,
when there's
yeah.
something in the corner of your eye, when there's something in your reality that is scary. And that's that's to me what the sort of real fear of climate change and environmentalism is. And this is, a theme of this chat, I guess. It's not an
Yeah.
other thing that you solve. It is a change to everything. And that is a profoundly spiritual matter as much as anything else. And you need to listen to that. And I think art and culture and songs can do a lot of that, I reckon, is connecting that story. So I don't think you should write a song about, oh, it's awful, this line on a graph is going up, because then you'll be like all those other people that write songs doing that. Find that space somewhere where it's about what it means to be alive in this extraordinary time of what we're beginning to get our head around.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dave. This has been great. This is a music interview, spiritual podcast disguised as a music interview podcast. So I do try and tie that in because, I'm a member of a spiritual organization, and we see the Mother Earth as being a living creature. So it's not just this climate change that could cause millions of people to die and be homeless and that, but the Mother Earth is a conscious being that feels pain when you drill a hole in and pump in chemicals or pump out, steal the resources, and so that there's this Gaia, this little living organism. Because
the Gaia stuff is. I actually reread Gaia. I first read Gaia. So this is James Lovelock. His Gaia hypothesis, which I think was it late 1969, 1970, something like that. Yeah. He put it out into the world, and this is a scientist, tried PhD in chemistry, put this thing out basically in the 70s, going, we should conceive of the planet as one great living organism, and everything that lives on it and the planet itself being in symbiosis and all essentially being the same thing, right? And to that extent, it kind of regulates itself over time, where in the same way that a body regulates itself or an oven can regulate its own temperature. And he was treated as a crank when he came out with that. He was, and people just pigeonholed it as woo. And one of the reasons why he was treated as a crank was because it was ultimately a profoundly scientific concept that he deliberately chose poetic language. So I think he has this wonderful line at the start of it when he says, we need the facts to know where to go and words and poetry to inspire us to go there, or something like that, right? And it was derided for ages. And it is now basically that way of thinking is the foundation of all earth sciences and all, the way that we look at what to do about climate change. Is that this is one big chemical soup. We are part of it. It is part of us. It is profoundly complex in ways that people who like to cherry pick data and say climate change is all made up couldn't possibly hope to get across. And I reread it recently and I thought, like what an extraordinary bridging of inner and outer worlds, of science and spirituality,
it was a rare piece of work. No,
it's just extraordinary, and the more I read about that, the more you can kind of see that all of this stuff is basically the same. Like, maybe I'll leave you with a realization I had over the summer when I was not working very much. And I went down some kind of Wikipedia black holes, which is the thing I'd love to do once you can work out what the hell it's on about. And I realized that 4 different things might actually all just, I've got it here, so I'm going to read off my bit of paper because I always forget this, but 4 different things from 4 profoundly different domains are all actually, to me, the same thing, right? Which is kind of what someone who is religious thinks about God, what they think about God. This sort of more or less creative, more or less kind of guiding force that is in charge of something. So that is kind of the same as what a quantum theorist thinks about atoms and quarks, which is like there is something underpinning everything that holds everything together. It's not exactly the same, but there's a similarity there, which is also kind of the same as what Lovelock was describing about Gaia, that everything is one kind of big soup. And it's definitely the same as what I feel. I'm not religious, but I think I am
Mm-hmm.
what you would call spiritual. But when I'm standing I went to Orkney a few years ago, and I stood on the edge of cliffs in Orkney, and I watched the sea just battering, and this sense of incredible smallness, but also vastness that I had at the same time, right? And that sense of awe and wonder and majesty, I mean, to me, that's as close to God as makes no difference. And all of those ideas are, to me, the same idea, some way, and I can't quite elucidate that there is behind all of our daily lived transactional kind of experiences, there are bigger things that tie it all together. And for some people, they're God. For some people, it's spiritualism. For other people, it's the beauty and wonder of science, the beauty and wonder of exploration. But it's all basically, we need that inner wonder and that inner motivation and curiosity just as much as we need the facts and the figures. And I think Lovelock was right about that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that the most holy, the most sacred being you'll ever meet is the earth beneath your feet.
I agree with that.
That's a quote I heard. Yeah, it's from Dr. George King, the founder of the Aetherius Society that I'm a member of. That the earth is this living being. We think, it's a coincidence that the earth is at this tilt, and we have the perfect seasons, but it's actually a conscious living being that we're living on, and who is keeping us alive by being in this perfect position. So,
and isn't that just the most extraordinary thought? Just when you actually think about that, it's like what Brian Cox, the professor, not the actor, the way that he describes extraterrestrial life, and he says there's only two possibilities, and only one of these can be true, and they're both extraordinary thoughts. So either we are not alone in the universe, and that out there somewhere life has evolved separately, and there are other beings and creatures living their lives. And when you actually think about that, it's an extraordinary thing to get your head around. Or just as extraordinary, that we are alone in the universe, and this is it. This here sea of consciousness and this bounteous planet is it. This is the history and the totality of all conscious life that has ever existed. One of those two things must be true, certainly at a kind of human scale. And they are both incredible things to get your head around, right? And they both should inspire. I mean, to him, he's a profoundly atheist guy, but he talks about wonder, the wonder that sort of thing makes you think about, as basically indistinguishable. It uses the same language. It's basically indistinguishable from questions of God, in terms of, wow, what a thing to think about. And it requires you to think about your relationship to that.
Responsibility, yeah.
And responsibility, absolutely.
Yeah, because it's crazy to think, every millimeter of this earth is populated with life now. So, from the bottom of the oceans to the top of the mountains. So it's pretty unusual if it was only happened in this place at this time, after billions of years of the universe. So
that's it. But if that, whatever it is, it's why it's sad that we're spending so much time and effort trying to leave this planet and go and live on Mars.
Yeah.
Because
or mine the moon.
Mine the moon. There are people trying to mine the moon. Apparently, I heard that's why Elon Musk's rockets use methane, because you can get a load of that from the moon or something. Anyway, the point being is deliberately designing it to not need Earth. It's just it's such a shame that we've got this beautiful spaceship that we live on.
Yeah, spaceship Earth.
Spaceship Earth, right?
And that we now think there's people that want to sprinkle dust in the atmosphere to reflect the light back and things like that, and take on the management of the nature. And now they realize the cost, don't they? Now they realize how much we got for free before.
We've always got it for free. That's the thing. Like because I think again, it's the story that we tell. We conceive Earth giving us for free, and then stuff that has value as somehow being distinct. And there are some kind of well-meaning attempts, but in my view, wrong attempts to try to classify nature in monetary terms. So to put like financial values on nature, and you can see some stories will run of like Earth, the value of life in the oceans has been classified at $5.4 trillion or something like that. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to change them. I can see I get it. I see what they're trying to do. It's not for us, right? It's for people who make business decisions, for governments who think that they only have legitimacy to act if they can quantify an economic value. And I get it, but to me, that's worsening. That's a worsening of the problem. That is distancing ourselves from the, as you say, the essential minerals and life itself that sustains us. That's not a thing you can put into money.
Sinking to the level of the materialists, talking their language, but letting them pull us down.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, one of the challenges of trying to think about saving the planet is you have to hold two things in your head at once, which is like, what do we actually have to do right now to get this fixed? And I guess that might be one of the things we have to do, but that we also have to rehabilitate ourselves as not seeing everything as humans taking and extracting, and then when we're done with humans taking and extracting, we bury the waste in a literal or actual hole and hope that someone will take care of it. Only when you end that mindset do you start to get close to what this means. But at the same time, right now we also need a healthy dose of whatever works. And I think it's fine. This is, again, you have to kind of laugh at that sometimes, because it is fine to hold both those views at once, I think.
Yeah, if you didn't laugh, you'd cry.
Yeah. And that's fine too. Strong men also cry.
Oh, well, thanks, Dave. I'm going to have a little cry now.
Quite welcome. Thanks, man.
When the world changed, a warm night in July, the factories were working overtime to meet the rising demand, and never being a fire to feed the flames of man's desire. When the world changed, for her it was no surprise. For too long they'd been burning, the balance had been turning, but the point at which they'd learned was past the point of no return. She did it with a sigh, for all that she'd created would have to start again, all because of them and the ambitions of men. When the world changed, she knew they'd take it on, not accept the changes, try to intervene. Then only when they see the cost would they realize what they've lost. The attack. She wondered if she should, but it was for the greater good. The night the world changed, she didn't sleep at all. She thought about the changes, 'cause there could be no reverse. But things were getting hot, and man was never gonna stop. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to hear the song again, just go to Spotify, Deezer, iTunes, stream it till your heart's content, or even better, because 1,000 streams buys me a cup of coffee. is to pay $1 on podsongs.com. And all that money goes to pay for the musicians, Maurizio Sanicola and Massimino Vozza, and my researcher Dori Verba, and a cup of coffee. Alright, thanks very much. See you next time.